welcome. Thank you for trudging through the snow and cold and to be here. I'm called Nemecek, and I will be talking about imagining justice. I've been at Spring Arbor 36 years, and I'm still with Spring Arbor, but in Guatemala, there was a semester abroad program there, going on 5 years. So, a couple of questions. I'm going to try and get through this so we have plenty of time for the Q&A. This is the course description. St. John's Bible is organized around the themes of hospitality, transformation, and justice for God's people. And I'll talk about Donel Dorr's, what he calls his 3 conversions, and 3 types of imagination: moral imagination, sociological imagination, and prophetic imagination, and the role that they play in justice. This is an example of the St. John's Bible. Hopefully you've seen other examples from Luke chapter 2. So what we're going to do, the journey we're going to take together this morning, is we'll talk about how we define justice. We'll talk about these 3 conversions I mentioned, and then we'll talk about imagination. Moral imagination, sociological imagination, prophetic imagination, and the role that they play in working towards justice. So starting with definitions here, what is justice? In one of the Socratic dialogues, Socrates is talking to Thrasymachus and asks the question, what is justice? And Thrasymachus responds, justice is the interest of the stronger. What would that mean, justice is the interest of the stronger? Non-rhetorical questions. Yes?
You think the stronger should get their way, they should get what they want?
Yeah, kind of the perversion of the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules, or something like that. And obviously that's not what Socrates is saying is justice, but how justice, or what we call justice, often operates. When you hear the term justice, I think many people in the U.S. tend to think in terms of either procedural justice, the procedure is just, or criminal justice. Because we have way too many cop shows to tell. Retributive justice, I mean, people getting just rewards or something like that. And then there's distributive justice. And distributive justice is how any given society distributes things like wealth or prestige or power within the society, because those are different in different societies. And this, John Rawls, in his book, A Theory of Justice, when he talks about what he calls the just society, he says, the closest we can come to a just society is one designed through a veil of ignorance. That doesn't seem like a very enlightened way to approach it, but what he means through a veil of ignorance is you design the society before you know what role you will play in that society. So you may be at the top and you may be at the bottom, and the closest we can come, and obviously it's very hypothetical or theoretical, because we can't do that in reality. We are born into a society where the roles somewhat already fixed, but the closest we can come to a just society is one designed through a veil of ignorance. If we all got together and said, we'll decide later what roles we're going to play in society, but now let's decide how those roles operate and who gets what and so forth. And his argument is that we probably have something closer to equality or something along those lines if we did that. Justice in the Bible. One of the interesting things is if you read the King James Version of the Bible, the word justice shows up once. If you read the NIV, it shows up over 100 times. And one of the reasons for that is probably because it's the King James Bible. Verses like Amos 5:22 say, let judgment roll down like waters, righteousness like a flowing stream, in the King James Version of the Bible. In the NIV, it's justice roll down. I think kings like it better when judgment rolls down, because they're the ones that get to do judging. How do you like it less when justice rolls down? So the NIV has corrected what I would consider to be some of the mistranslations in the King James Version of the Bible. The word in Hebrew is mishpat, and that's what this is down here. Dikaiosune is the Greek that's used in the New Testament. And in one of the places where there's it's not so much a mistranslation, but what I would consider a half translation. Dikaiosune is translated in the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after, what's the next word? Righteousness. In the English, it's righteousness. If you read a Spanish Bible, which some of the people here have done perhaps, it says, por justicia. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they shall be filled. And the Greek word, dikaiosune, has both meanings contained in it. So the English translation gets it half right, and the Spanish translation gets it half right, but it's really both things, two sides of the same coin in Greek. And when this verse is used, it's most often associated with economic justice in Scripture, or distributive justice as we've talked about. So that's how we're thinking about talking about justice here. Any questions on that so far or comments? I'll give you lots of chances to jump in, but hopefully some dialogue at the end. This is a book by Donel Dorr, which Mary Darling references in her book, God of Intimacy in Action. What does God require? Do justice, love tenderly, and walk humbly with your God. That's Micah 6:8, 6-8 actually. And in it, Donel Dorr compares these three conversions to these three parts of Micah 6:8. Personal conversion, moral conversion, and what he calls political conversion, or doing justice. And we'll talk about these three in a little greater detail, but moral conversion, we mostly associate with things like empathy, caring for the other, concern for the other, and so forth. And that's what he connects to loving tenderly. Let me talk a little bit more about these. Personal conversion, in the evangelical tradition, we often talk about personal conversion as the day we prayed the Jesus prayer or came down to the altar. I first did when I was 6, twice when I was 8, once again when I was 9, just to make sure the last time took. But I was probably 14 when I really understood what conversion meant. And the way we talk about personal conversion in evangelical circles is partly right. And by partly right, I mean, yes, it includes that kind of beginning point, but the way Donel Dorr talks about it, I think, is more accurate in that that kind of personal conversion is the beginning of conversion, not the end of conversion. And conversion is a lifelong process of spiritual formation. You may have heard that from the other circles. And so personal conversion is developing the mind of Christ, touching the heart of God, all of that. And that I'm still working on being converted in that regard. Does that make sense? Moral conversion, loving tenderly, and that is that kind of empathic concern for the other. And moral conversion is when we can identify with the suffering of others, the pain of others, the needs of others in profound ways. And that's what he connects to loving tenderly. And then what he calls political conversion, we can talk about it as systemic conversion or something like that, but it means recognizing the relationship between the pain and suffering that the other is experiencing and the environment in which they exist. How the systems maybe help alleviate the pain and may in fact cause the pain under some circumstances. And what I want to talk about is how imagination relates to these. You may recognize that guy, who's probably the one considered the most knowledgeable guy in the world sometimes, but he said imagination is more important than knowledge. And certainly knowledge isn't a bad thing, or you would not be here, I assume. So knowledge is good, but knowledge without imagination means just memorizing what is and not envisioning what could be or what might be different or how we might think differently about the world in which we exist. And so, starting with moral imagination is a necessary component to move from personal conversion to moral conversion. Great, I'm saved, I went down to the altar and so forth, but what's that got to do with my neighbor? And moral conversion, Scripture has an awful lot to say about how we ought to treat our neighbor and that kind of thing. But to do that adequately, we have to be able to enter the world with the other. And that's what takes moral imagination, to be able to say, what if that were me in that circumstance? How would I respond? How would that make me feel? And how can I relate to that? And that is necessary for that movement to moral conversion, where the suffering of the other becomes our own. I think I talked about this in Focus last year, but the closest I can come to personally identifying with moral conversion is one time when I was in London with a group of students, and the students were doing something else, so I decided to go to Old Bailey, which is the criminal court. And I was mostly going because I was teaching criminology, and I thought it'd be fun to see the guys wearing the funky wigs they wear and stuff like that. But we get there, and it's a rape murder trial. And 15 minutes into the trial, they cleared the courtroom to discuss a procedural point. And so I'm standing out in a hallway with a bunch of other people, and I began to wonder, which of these people is the mother of the victim? Who's the father of the accused here? And when I began to ask that question, I began to feel their pain. And I don't know these people, I don't know who they are, and I don't know if any of them were the mother or father of the victim or the accused. But I could just, for a minute, imagine what it must feel like to be there watching this trial proceed, and the pain. And I did some contemplative prayer for a bit and left, because that's why I was there. It took me a while to get that was my purpose in being there. So that's what I mean, even with people we don't know, if we can have some sense of empathy, some sense of connectedness to their pain, their suffering, the world they exist in, that's moral imagination. And it's absolutely critical for any sense of moral conversion. This is the way it's defined by one author: an ability to imaginatively discern various possibilities for acting in a given situation and to envision the potential help and harm that are likely to result from a given action. And so imagination plays a really, really critical role in thinking about what a just world would look like. Any questions or comments on that? Sociological imagination is a term coined by C. Wright Mills, a book by that name that's very popular in sociology classes. He describes it as the vivid awareness of the relationship between personal experience and the wider society. In other places, they talk about it as sociological imagination is what happens at the intersection of history and biography. And so my sense of personal experience, what I'm experiencing, or another person's personal experience, and how that relates to the larger society, and how the world is shaped, and maybe the pain and suffering of the problems are shaped by conditions in the larger society. And we have a tendency, in the World Values Survey that is taken sometimes, one of the things they measure is individualism versus collectivism. And guess which country shows up as the most individualistic nation on earth? We're number one. And sometimes that makes it easy to kind of reduce things to personal problems. It's their personality traits, it's their personal characteristics, and so forth. John Perkins, there's two different John Perkins. This is the one that didn't write Confessions of an Economic Hitman. The one that did write A Quiet Revolution says, "Don't bother teaching me to fish if you're not going to give me access to the pond." And that's in response to that: give a man a fish, you give him a meal, teach him to fish, and feed him for life, but not if he doesn't have access to the pond. And that's that intersection between personal experience and the larger society in which the person exists. If there's no access to the pond, not much point in teaching people to fish. Does that make sense? Again, that's the sociological imagination. Prophetic imagination, the book by Walter Brueggemann, who's probably the foremost Old Testament scholar, says the task of prophetic ministry is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture around us. And in that book, he contrasts the royal consciousness with alternative consciousness. The royal consciousness of Pharaoh with an alternative consciousness of Moses. The royal consciousness of Caesar with the alternative consciousness of Jesus. It's an example of that contrast between the two. And he also talks about what he calls prophetic critique and prophetic energizing. Prophetic critique and prophetic energizing. And if you read the Old Testament prophets, and I'll give an example of that in a little bit, it's full of that kind of, on the one hand, prophetic critique. Amos saying, you sell the needy for a pair of sandals, kind of thing, or a pair of Nikes, or something like that. And then prophetic energizing, if you do it this way, this is what I will do, is what God is saying to the people of Israel, if you engage in righteousness. So some examples of, first, the royal consciousness and alternative consciousness. What we mean by those two things. The royal consciousness represents an economics of affluence, a politics of oppression, and a religion of immanence. What he means by that third point, a religion of immanence, is that God is actually, the leaders represent God's will, or something like that. So immanent in that sense. The divine right of kings, or the emperor, is divine. If you don't know, and I'll talk more about this in chapel on Monday, Caesar was described, Augustus Caesar was described as divine, born of a virgin, the bringer of good news, etc. All those labels applied to Caesar. Several years ago, I was at a conference where John Dominic Crossan was speaking, and I finished reading his book, God and Empire, so I went up to talk to him about it. He's an Irish Catholic priest, so he said in his rather charming Irish accent, well, if you had to sum up the whole of the gospel in just 2 words, it would be, Caesar sucks. Now, I'd probably use more words than that myself, but it's in there. That is, the gospel writers are, especially Luke, are frequently contrasting, deliberately contrasting the kingdoms of this world with the kingdom of God. Luke talks more about the kingdom of God than anything else. And so much of it is in direct opposition, direct contrast to the royal consciousness. And the kingdom of God is about promoting an alternative consciousness. The church I go to in Antigua, Guatemala, where I live, the priest was really was talking about this in a different way. He was saying, I'll give you 2 phrases from 2 different sermons, stealing from him from our chapel address on Monday, which is a preview. He said, we spent so much time asking, why did Jesus die? That we neglect the question, why did Jesus live? And he lived to teach us about the kingdom of God, a different way of being in the world, an alternative consciousness, if you will. And one of the ways that he contrasted that is, this is actually a quote from Gladstone, the love of power versus the power of love. There's 2 different ways. And if you think of Caesar and the Roman Empire and so forth, the love of power. If you think about the temptations of Jesus in the wilderness, really tempted by wealth, status, and power. Status, if you throw yourself down, your angels will take care of you. I'll give you all the kingdoms of this world. Turn these breads into stone, use your power, and so forth. And instead, Jesus goes into the synagogue right after that and reads from Isaiah 61, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to break good news to the poor. And so this is an issue that runs throughout Luke's gospel in particular, but all of the gospels, I would say. Instead of an economics of affluence, an economics of justice. Instead of a politics of oppression, a politics of liberation. Instead of a religion of immanence, a religion of transcendence. God is not the king. God is not the emperor. He's a God that transcends time and space, and that's the God we worship. Prophetic critique is really well illustrated in Isaiah chapter 58. And if you read the whole chapter sometime, it starts by the people are saying to God, you know, we fasted, we've done all this, but you're not listening to us, and all of that. And God goes on to say, but you, on your day of fasting, and this is the critiques he makes, you exploit your workers, you quarrel, you strike with a fist, you oppress people. Finger pointing, in the Anchor Bible, they say finger pointing is not this, it's a different finger in a different position, actually. So the verb may have a very long history according to the Anchor Bible. Malicious talk, so that's what you're doing on your day of fasting. And then it goes on to say, this is the kind of fast I choose. So starting with a prophetic critique, this is what you've got wrong. Now this is what you should be doing. Loose the chains of injustice, untie the cords of the yoke, set the oppressed free, share your food with the hungry, shelter the wanderer, clothe the naked, and meet the needs of the oppressed. And the other part of prophetic energizing, reading from the last part of this, I'm going to start at verse 10. And if you spend yourselves in behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness, and your night will become like noonday. The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up the age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings. That's the prophetic energizing, saying if you get this right, if you stop doing what you're doing and instead take care of those around you the way you should, this is what God will do, and this is what will result from your actions. So prophetic critique and prophetic energizing. And then this becomes the path to justice. From personal conversion to moral imagination. As we develop the mind of Christ, as we learn to touch the heart of God, or I can talk about it as one hand touching the heart of God and the other stretched out to the world around us. And if we learn to live out of that position, we will eventually develop that sense of moral imagination that leads to moral conversion. When I was outside that courtroom in London, it was God that was weeping through me. Does that make sense? When I touched the heart of God and I could feel the pain that God felt for that situation, God is on both sides. God's not saying you have to punish this guy, he's weeping for everybody involved in the situation. Sociological imagination becomes really important because sometimes when we try to do justice, we end up doing prescription before diagnosis, if that makes sense. If you went to a doctor and the doctor never did anything, you go to a prescription automatically, I think you'd find a new doctor. Now, if you think about different development initiatives or missions projects that do the same thing, prescription first, diagnosis later kind of thing, and that's where sociological imagination comes in, where we're able to say, why is this the way it is? And what will fix it long term? What needs to change in this situation to bring about healing, to bring about wholeness? And then part of prophetic critique and prophetic energizing is developing a vision for the world as it should be. And that's where I don't think sociology can help me. Sociology helps me when I'm trying to diagnose why it is as it is. But that's when I turn to my faith to say, what does God want? What's the heart of God? And how is the world supposed to be in the kingdom of God? And that's the prophetic energizing. And that's what allows us then to move from prophetic energizing to political conversion. Now that political conversion is a term that can be easily misunderstood because I don't mean necessarily just voting for the right candidate, for the right party or something like that. It's a whole lot bigger than that. And it's looking at the society as a whole, how it operates, who it hurts, who it privileges, and those kinds of things, and what God would have us do in the midst of that. And we can talk about specific examples that you want to bring up. But that's my last slide. But part of love thy neighbor did you not understand, Jesus doing a kind of face palm or something like that, because I think sometimes we don't understand all of that. So, what kinds of questions, comments, conversation starters? Yes?
Who was it that said, we ask so often, why did Jesus die?
It was Father John Sanders, my priest at the Episcopal Church, yes. Yep. How's that for a unique name, John? Probably became a priest so you put Reverend in front of it to distinguish him from all the other Johns. What else? What other kinds of questions? or comments? Yes?
I think it's interesting that you said that empathy and connection is critical for moral conversion, because I didn't feel any of that like exact moral conversion until like we took our trip to Guatemala, and I feel like a lot of people in the United States would benefit from some sort of like experience or exposure to an outside world.
Yeah.
And I wonder if like, I'm not sure if the people like in all of like the political parties in the US are traveling, but I think that that would be good for like every nation to have their government be traveling to different countries
Yeah.
and experiencing different values and cultures.
I pastored a church in an African-American neighborhood, an interracial church in an African-American neighborhood for 2 years, and I didn't understand what it meant to be white until I lived in Black neighborhood. It helped me see myself a little more clearly. Similarly, I've read 50 cross-culturals now, Guatemala, Costa Rica, Belize, Jamaica, England, Scotland, and the Czech Republic, and they help me understand what it means to be an American. But at the same time, I can enter their world and in some ways try to identify with their experience of the world, good and bad, and all of that. And I think there's a Czech philosopher named Comenius that says there are 4 levels of education: primary, secondary, post-secondary, and travel. He sees travel as the highest, which is why we have a cross-cultural requirement, because it is so critical, I think, to understand the rest of the world. How do you love your neighbor if you don't know your neighbor? You don't know what your neighbor's going through, and how do you get a more expansive sense of neighbor? Last year at Focus, I talked about us versus them, and we tend to have a pretty narrow definition of who we are, the us, and a very broad definition of them, people who fit in that category. Now, there's something about entering other cultures and other worlds that allows you to push beyond that a little bit. And one of the reasons for years, I think I took over 100 Chicago weekends for 1,400 over the years, 50 cross-culturals. One of the reasons I do that is a little selfish. You know, I realized it would be easy for me to just have a comfortable life in Spring Harbor and just kind of forget about all that stuff. And for my own spiritual growth, it was important for me to stay connected to people who are suffering in whatever ways I could, and to keep reminding myself of how other people live. And it's just too easy in our suburban environments and things like that to disconnect. And it doesn't mean there isn't suffering right next door to you in your suburban environment, but it's easy to get isolated and insulated from that. Yeah.
I have an impression of communication from Mary Darling right now.
Yes.
We had talked a little bit, we wrote a blog post that talked about the collapse of compassion, which is basically like, when you see one person suffering, you feel bad. You see 2, you feel worse, 3, etc. So you would think that the injustice of hundreds of thousands or millions of people would make you feel awful, but instead you kind of just disconnect from that in order to insulate yourself from the pain of
Not my problem.
You felt all that pain for all those people, it would just burn you out.
Yeah.
And you talked about how privileged societies really are able to disconnect from that so much better, because we have so much keeping us grounded, keeping us stable. It's just like, okay, well, it's not me.
Yeah.
This is how I can disconnect.
Yeah,
How do you recommend how to happen
by intentionally stepping into that moral imagination thing. I don't know if you guys saw the picture of the Syrian refugee, a 3-year-old kid on a beach that drowned and stuff. I mean, it haunts me. And it should. I mean, that's not the way God intends the world to be. And it's going to be harder and harder to isolate ourselves and insulate ourselves, because the pain and suffering of the third world is coming to our front door, whether it's the US or Europe, and it's going to continue to be that way, because the developed nations of the world are going to make up a smaller and smaller percentage of the world's population. We're pretty close to 0 population growth in Western Europe and the US. Most of our growth is through immigration, meaning that the poor of the world are going to make up a larger and larger percentage of the world's population, and a population that through social media is more aware of the disparity than ever before. And that's why Europe is facing an immigration crisis, and as we are. I mean, one of the times on my Facebook feed after the shooting in California, my Facebook feed, one right after another, were two different posts. One was a post about 19 hate crimes against Muslims in the US in the previous week. And the post right after it was about Syrian refugees, 163 Syrian refugees arriving in Canada. And the Prime Minister met them at the airport and had winter coats for everybody. And a children's choir sang a welcoming song in Arabic. Which comes closer to the kingdom of God? I mean, I was really trying to think of a better word than ashamed of my country, but it was close. It was pretty close at that point. And just the rhetoric around the refugees, and it's not like anybody in, all of that stuff. There have been 750,000 refugees since 2001, and the number involved in terrorism has been 0 at this point. And so I think our fear gets in the way, and God's not given us a spirit of fear, but our fear gets in the way of living out the kingdom of God sometimes. And it's really about kind of self-protection or isolation, insulation kind of thing. I don't know whatever came of it. At one point I read that Asbury Seminary was taking in some Syrian refugees, and I was immediately thinking, hey, don't we have some empty dorm rooms here? And so some Syrian refugees. It would be good for all of us, so I want to propose that. Other questions? Yeah.
How do you feel about like the debate between like keeping Muslims out of our country as a whole? Like what does that do for you?
Let me start by saying this is the craziest year for election politics in my 61 years, 62 years almost. I think it's back to the point that Tessa was making about compassion. My biggest concern for America is the loss of commitment to the common good. That sense of it's all about me and protecting myself and my interests and so forth. I think that has the potential to bring down a nation in the long run. And I think it's the responsibility of the church to recapture what Martin Luther King called prophetic zeal. Years ago, Martin Luther King said, "The judgment of God is upon the church for its failure to be true to its prophetic mission." The church must recapture its prophetic zeal, or it will become a social club without spiritual or moral authority. And I think we're at risk there. I think the church should be leading the way and saying, this is who we are, this is how we live out the kingdom of God, by looking out for our neighbor and for those who are disenfranchised, marginalized, oppressed, and so forth. Other questions, comments on any of that? I may be stepping on toes with this, but how did the worship service become the primary focal point of the church? And to flip the question a bit, maybe service as a form of worship. I'm not saying do away with the worship service, but I think part of the prophetic mission of the church could be to say service as worship. And that's really what Isaiah 58 is saying. Unto the yoke of the oppressed, so that's free, etc. That's a key part of it. And that's what Jesus emphasizes in Luke chapter 4 when he reads from Isaiah 61. And we don't see a lot in the early church about their worship services. And they had, I'm not saying do away with worship services by any means, but when that becomes the basis on which people choose their church and the focal point of the church, then it means maybe the church has lost its prophetic zeal somewhere along the line and isn't what it's really called to be. Other questions? Any of that? Yes?
In terms of like political conversion, like a lot of times what's tough with that is like you might make a change to like help one group, but then you're gonna hurt another group by doing that. Like I guess kind of like how's the balance with that? Is it like majority or?
That's a tough call, and trying to figure out how to enter in this without being too partisan in my comments, but I'll jump in and see what I can do. There's a lot of conversation going around because of one of the candidates about capitalism versus socialism and all that. The reality is that the vast majority of countries in the world are mixed economies. Part capitalist, part socialist. We have Pell Grants, we have Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, other things that could be called socialist. We have free enterprise in the US, as do Sweden, Denmark, Norway, some of the other countries that one of those candidates is talking about. The real question is what things ought to be considered public goods and what things are best handled by private enterprise. And for me, that becomes an empirical question. That's where the sociological imagination comes in. Which things, based on the empirical evidence, are better handled by the public sector, by the government or something like that? Which things are better handled? And I'll give one quick example. My first job for Spring Arbor was working at Jackson Prison. We used to have the prisoner education program, and I was the on-site coordinator at an office in the maximum security section of the prison. And so that's 1979, so a long time ago. But a recent trend in the US is private for-profit prisons, so you can buy stock in a prison and make money if more people are incarcerated and things like that. I'm not sure private for-profit prisons are a good idea. In fact, I'm pretty sure they're not a good idea and not best handled by the private sector. Now, and the fight is usually not over really capitalism versus socialism, but which things do we put in that pool in the middle called public goods or common good? Education, a lot of public schools and things like that. We're fighting over healthcare and where that belongs, above all public-private play, things like that. And you're right, that some may be asked to shoulder more of a burden, help others, and it's not, there's no easy solution. We'll be fighting about it for some time to come. But the question for me is always, whose interests do I advocate for? And part of it means that's where the moral conversion comes in. Do I just look out for my own interests in that process? Or do I, and one example of that, when I lived over in Sandstone, somebody put a letter in my mailbox and said, somebody's trying to build a quadplex nearby for apartments in this thing. That would pull down our housing prices, or the values of our homes joined with us and protesting this and keeping them out. Okay, but on the other side, there is an issue with affordable housing and so forth. And I can take ahead and evaluate my home if someone else can find affordable housing to live in, kind of thing. And so those are the kinds of questions I try to ask, is not just look out for my own interests all the time. I do pretty well. I've got a nice, comfortable life. I don't have to deal with snow most of the time. Actually, never when I'm in Guatemala, at least. Record low of 44, record high of 88, that kind of in a pretty cushy life. But how do people around fare? And how do my actions impact theirs? That's the intersection of biography and history that we're talking about. And you're right, it's not, it's messy. And it's going to get messier in the next, how long to November? Next 9 months. More mud and snow and other things like that. And we need reasoned discourse to say, what are our values, what are our goals, and how do we get there in a way that's fair. Other questions or comments? Or disagreements? I usually like to start by teach by starting fights if we can. So we welcome disagreements. All right, well, if there are no more, thanks so much for coming. I'm going to be around speaking in Mary Darling's Intercultural Conquest tomorrow and Tuesday, speaking in chapel on Monday, doing video supporting my class on Friday. And most importantly, I'll be at Market Day on Tuesday. So if any of you are thinking about spending a semester or a J term in Guatemala or elsewhere for that, come to Market Day. And so thanks again for coming.